criminal law, immigrant experiences of resettlement, post-conflict, post-peace accord rebuilding, and civil liberties in a polarized world. Of course, Saad is also a joint master's program and PhD alumnus of our University of Manitoba Peace and Conflict Studies program, and a frequent academic award recipient. So we are very pleased to have this series of brown bag lectures with our alumni. And in particular, today we're looking forward to hearing from Saad. So please, Dr. Khan, could you begin your presentation?
Thank you, Dr. Reens, for the very kind words, and good morning, everyone. It seems rather strange to be speaking at the Moral Center in this capacity. I was remembering earlier this morning that it was 8 years ago, slightly over 8 years ago, that I walked into the Moral Center boardroom. And it reminded me of what Yeats said many, many years ago. From our birthday until we die is but the winking of an eye. And it does seem like a wink of an eye. Beyond that, I would also like to offer a word of thanks to Sean, whom many of you do know. He was my advisor for the 8 years that I spent at the Morrow Center. And he's instrumental not only in my doctoral research, but in this book as well. Jessica as well, who looked over the book, told me about a few things that needed to be done and a few things that did not need to be done. Jason has been helpful over the years, and a word of thanks to him for arranging this as well. And Susan, of course, who was my first contact, so to speak, when I came to the Morrow Center way back in 2013. The way I'm going to try and do this today is that we are going to very briefly look at the structure of what is my book now. And I was trained as a lawyer, so we do love to talk a lot. I'll try not to. And we are going to sort of go through a bird's eye view of this book, right? We are going to look at why I did what I did in this research. I conducted it. So we look at the story behind the stories, as I call it. What I intended to achieve through this research. And then I'm going to let the participants of this research speak to you directly. It's their data, these are their stories. So we are going to look at how they framed what eventually became this book. We are going to look at future pathways, i.e. where we are and where do we go from here? And of course, I love questions, so we are going to open up the floor to those. The way I've structured the book is that to frame this sense of angst and the sense of alienation which is felt by some second generation immigrants of Pakistani descent, we look at a little bit of immigration policies in Canada in the 20th century. I won't go through those in today's talk, but suffice enough to say that until 1977, immigrants of color were not very welcome in this country. And so that transgenerational carryover of angst and trauma we find in second and even third and subsequent generations of immigrants. To frame the findings of this research and this book, I looked at different literature streams. Of course, identity was the biggest one, so there's plenty of identity literature in the book. There is lots of work on radicalization in the field already out there. So I use that as somewhat of a framework to find out whether these findings could be supported in current literature. In some ways they were, in some ways they weren't. Structural violence, which many of our PAX colleagues know about, Basic Human Needs by John Burton. And then gangs. So, is there an analogy between individuals who join gangs and individuals who say join the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria? I looked at that literature. And then the Hadley Cantrell self anchoring model, which looks at hopes and dreams for the future. The next three chapters are the stories of the participants in relation to their identity, then in relation to what they feel are the reasons why some individuals from the second generation Pakistani community in Canada tend to gravitate towards the Islamic State and Al Qaeda and what is known as Islamic extremism. Finally, what were their hopes and fears? Did they dream of a better future? What were they apprehensive about? And the way forward. So these are the five chapters in which this book is structured. And we begin with why I essentially did this research. Well, the aims were, first of all, identity, and more on that in a moment. But how do these individuals perceive themselves? Do they see themselves as Canadians? Do they see themselves as Pakistanis? Do they see themselves as Muslims? They were born on the soil of this country. So, what's happening here, right? And to answer that question, we have to look at identity issues. Then, what were their perceptions about the Canadian polity itself? How do they see themselves within this Federation of Canada? Do they feel as if they're outsiders? Do they feel some connection? What is happening? What do they think is, or if there are any issues with race relations in this country? I tried to find that out. Finally, why certain individuals gravitate towards radicalization to violence. It's a very tiny minority, right, which ends up joining these groups. But why? That was the essential question. And why this research in the first place? Saad Bhai, did you get to hear about Misbah? Misbah? No, I haven't heard anything about him for a while. What happened? Amr looked at me, his expression a mixture of sadness and something akin to excitement. Saad Bhai, Misbah was martyred while trying to shoot down an infidel drone in the northern areas of Pakistan. This was back in 2010. I had just returned from the United States after spending a couple of years there. Misbah was someone I knew from my student politics days. Both Misbah and I were part of this political organization which aimed to bring by a democratic dispensation in Pakistan based on Islamic values. From what I remembered, he was a nice fellow. He was attaining a degree in, if I remember correctly, applied physics, belonged to an urban middle class educated family, and he died. I call it Misbah's Jihad. So I think what eventually became this book and this study, the seeds of that were sowed those 12, 13 years ago, because I tried to understand why someone like him, educated, good family, what would trigger such a person to go and basically give up his life? He wasn't even 30. One answer was from Macbeth. As Shakespeare writes, that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. Right? So maybe it was this narrative that was espoused by the state for 3 decades that waging a holy war uh, is the ultimate thing to do. Maybe that was Misbah's war. Maybe I could understand it that way. But then I started to read about the 7/7 bombers in London. the Toronto 18 in Canada, and a number of cases in the United States. The state in Canada or in the US or in many Western European countries did not espouse a narrative of waging a holy war. So, why do these young people feel so alienated that some of them try to take the lives of those people whom they never had a beef with to begin in the first place? And that is, in fact, the purpose of this book. So what did I do? Well, I tried to interview, and I did, individuals who were born in this country to Pakistani immigrants, who were educated in this country, and they were across the gender and the educational divide. A couple of them had doctorates. One was pursuing a doc. One was a full-time professor in Pakistan. He had moved to Pakistan. One was an undergraduate. So pretty much, when it came to demographics, across the board. And as you can see on your screens, I have a little bit of information about them. Of course, I use pseudonyms. And what did I discover? Well, in terms of identity, or as I frame the question, who am I? Because the way I see identity is that the basis of identity is how we perceive ourselves in relation to the world and what our place in this world is, and how do we perceive the world to perceive us in relation with it, right? And identity is a tense issue. But a couple of things stood out with the interviews that I conducted. One was that childhood experiences, what these people went through as children, played a key role in shaping and framing their worldview. And also discrimination, which they labeled as white privilege. And we are going to look at a few snippets in their own words. This is from Marjan, who was a PhD student. When someone tells you literally that you are ugly, you know that you're brown, you're not pretty, and the big one was that you're brown. At one point in my life in grade 9, two guys came to me and they spit chocolate from their mouths. They were chewing on to me and said, "Now you're dark enough." So that is traumatic on a level that cannot be explained. And of course, I could not speak to my parents about it, and no one knows that on my way to school, I had to go through that. I had to compose myself and learn how to compartmentalize psychologically that I will be dealing with this. At that time, I felt like I would be dealing this for the rest of with this for the rest of my life. For Marjan, this was a scarring memory of her childhood to basically be bullied in the most inhumane of ways, I suppose, as a child because of the color of her skin. For Babar, who actually served in the Canadian Armed Forces for a while and was born in Ottawa in the late 60s, in his day and age, it was a different discriminatory framework. So in his words, I was horrified the way some of my friends would talk about the Quebecois or Franco-Ontarians. I remember once it was like in grade 4 or 5 that they were setting up this thing where people, school children, could exchange letters from different provinces. And actually, this was some province in America they thought was Quebec. And one of the kids yells, "Not Quebec, they are French." And the teacher is horrified and told him what a bigot he was, and so on and so forth. So the problem, I suppose, was there, right? At one point, and this was after the October crisis, the focus was on French Canadians. and then it shifted later on. So all of these participants, they kind of had different ways of perceiving the patterns of discrimination over the years, which framed their identity. As Babar continued, the difference wasn't in terms of skin color. That was not the case then. White privilege. In the social sciences and now in common discourse as well, this is a term which is lobbed around a lot. And I asked all of my participants about white privilege, their experiences with it, what they thought it was. So for Javeria, who is a social worker, here's an example of white privilege. Yeah, they, those who use language to look down upon people who weren't fluent in English, were white only, only white. We had a lot of different races: blacks, browns, Pakistanis, Chinese. We would never be rude. Minorities understand what it feels like, what it is to learn a language. White people don't. Maybe if they're Polish, they would, but generally the population in my area was just Canadian. They maybe had European descent very long ago, but generally they only knew their one language. They don't understand what it feels like to learn a second language and to be able to understand this. My parents knew other languages, and these white people, they don't understand the struggle to learn English and to be in a completely different area and to make someone feel like an outsider. Yeah. So for Natasha here, it wasn't white privilege being enforced against her per se. It was more against her parents, more against other first generation immigrants who spoke with an accent, right? And that to her was an indicator of things that were wrong and things that shaped her identity in a way where she had a deep mistrust of the dominant majority in this country. I talked to Zamir, who was the chief of staff to a member of parliament, and in his words, white privilege? Well, I don't think white privilege directly exists in Canada, or we would never be here. But you know, it may exist south of the border more than it does in the north, and it may not be a phenomenon here. We have to understand that Canada's makeup is changing year by year. The demographics are changing, the way our forefathers and the history here of being of a British background, it is now being diluted. So maybe there were some times in the old days when it did exist. The older generations are used to a certain way, a certain culture, and stuff like that. That's breaking down. And even 50 years from now, it will be a different way of life here. So white privilege and so forth, we have yet to encounter it, right? So a divergence of views here as well. For Natasha, it was rampant in almost everything. For Zamir here, who serves as the chief of staff to a politician, white privilege is not in this country. Again, that shapes our relation or their relation to Canada and what they sort of think of their place in this polity. Amir had a completely different outlook here. And this was actually surprising in many ways. According to Amir, who works in a Crown Corporation, the racism wasn't only from white people per se. Like native people were very racist as well. Like they were worse than white people. The word Paki would just slide off their tongue like it's a correct term. And like you could be at the mall and they'd say, "Hey Paki." What do you say to that? What do you say when you hear that Paki is this and that? And like that's a weird thing. The most racism came from the Aboriginal population than it did from white people. And when I went through this data, even while Amr was narrating this, lateral violence, the term came to my mind. And this was a very surprising thing to to hear, to be honest. And so we see that, again, these were snippets. Of course, there's way more data in the book on this, but it isn't a one size fit all as we like to presume. Usually, the way we perceive the world, our experiences of discrimination, our experiences of what we call racism, even within a community of people who have a similar background in terms of ethnicity and religion and nationality, even for them it differs, right? But discrimination and childhood experiences really shape how we go about in our daily lives and how we see the world and how we radicalize. And so when I asked my participants about what do you think pushes these kids, what are the triggers for them to basically, don on a suicide jacket or and try to blow themselves up in this country. And thank goodness that hasn't happened successfully here. They said a few things, and I broke it down into there were mental health issues, definitely. Identity, they mentioned, was a huge thing, and how identity was framed, which led to radicalization. The role of the media, the role of the Muslim community itself in radicalizing these kids, and external actors and external factors. And I'll very briefly go through all these five in their own words. So, when it came to mental health, a lecturer in psychology told me, when it comes to radicalization, that if it's Muslims specifically, I think there's a lot of anger in some parts of the community. But mostly, the vast majority that I have seen use that anger constructively. They will do social work, they will help their communities, they will do research. They express it in ways that are helpful, that are fruitful in most ways, and maybe again, ones who I don't know. I haven't read much on this specific issue, so I don't really know. But I think there is some sense of, I think whatever we see in men who join gangs or other forms of groups would be relevant. If you're looking at white guys who join white supremacist groups, I think there can be parallels between them and being radicalized. I think that there are parallels between them and Muslim radicals, certain identification, desire of identification, belonging, looking for something that's missing. In their history, there is trauma in their lives they're unable to deal with and not causing certain problems. So I think that it's a combination of things. Outside of being Muslims, it's about mental health, identification, masculinity, those types of things. So for Zainab, it's not just, hey, you're a Muslim, you're a terrorist. No, it's a combination of so many things, traumas and mental health, how they identify themselves, their masculinity, and so on. And she drew a parallel between white supremacists, radicalized Muslims, and gang members. For Marjan, why do they radicalize? Well, I know some people say they are coming from a wealthy background, but what's the family life like? No one talks about sexual abuse. No one talks about other things that are going on. So, this is a deeper issue because I know I would have turned, and I'll tell you why I would have turned. I could not speak to my parents. They had no idea. I was bullied every single day in high school. So if I'm lonely and have no one to talk to, there is a generational gap that is there. Neglect could be a lot of things which affects this radicalization process. In other words, Marjan, and this was a common finding as well in this study, that Marjan said that she couldn't find the comfort of confiding what she was going through as a child with her parents. And I can only imagine what that does to someone, that you go home and that you can't tell your mom and dad that, hey, this is what happened to me at school. right? And of course, then you're going to find other individuals who provide that quote unquote familial support. And recruiters, by the way, are really good at this. They fill in that void. For another one, for Natasha here, they are pushed, she felt, to radicalization. In her words, I wear the hijab, the very symbol of the Muslim woman. Men can get away, but Muslim women, they look Muslim. That's why there were so many issues when I was in high school. Something, if I remember correctly, about Muslim women being attacked on buses. My parents were so scared that they didn't want me to use the bus, and I told them, I need to bus. How will I get to school otherwise? A friend of mine who was reading a newspaper in the subway coming to school, an elderly white gentleman yanked it out of her hand and said, you aren't allowed to read the news if you are the one making it. And the things they said about us and going anywhere, walking anywhere, it's so unfair. Right? So for Natasha, it's the dominant majority which basically tells you you are a terrorist. Right? And they push you away. And if you push us away, according to Natasha, what else do you expect us to do? We are going to try and find refuge somewhere. And in a minority of cases, that somewhere is in the ever hating embrace of clerics and preachers, hate preachers. She also said, and this was striking, we will never be white. You know, we are who we are. We have to be okay with that. I think that because you have this issue, you will never become them, no matter how much you become them. Doesn't matter if you completely abandon your own values and everything, your own identity, you will never still be them. It could drive someone crazy. I've tried my hardest, and it's also subconscious. Who you hang out with, where you live, and stuff, you really need that value, you know. When you don't have it, you kind of feel like, I want to be like them white people. When that doesn't happen, you turn to religion and to radicals because you feel that they are preaching what you are feeling. It's this subconscious thing, and you relate to them not because you want to be with them, but you feel as if it's right. It's relatable. You think that this is Islam. This is what I've been taught, you know. Um, this identification is problematic, right? Because according to Natasha, she tried to, whatever means why I tried to be white, but she could never be white. And so there is, I believe, this sense of rejection that the dominant majority doesn't want us. In the words of Marjan, our own parents we can't confide in. What do we do? And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, hate preachers come in because they tell you, they really tap that deep resentment and that angst that a young person has and tell you that, hey, you belong with us, come to us. For Marjan, again, I'll say, why is it that I'm linked to a Pakistani thing if anyone did anything, a crazy group? Why would I be linked there? Oh, I wonder why. Because I've been labeled that already. Of course, I'm going to where I'm connected to. You have made me Pakistani from day one. I'm Canadian born, so yeah, this is not about choosing your group and the group comes to you. Society has also continuously told me that I don't belong. So I'm going to go where I belong. That makes sense to me. It's not shocking, it's pretty basic. Where are you going to go? Well, where society told you to go, right? Again, a reflection of what Natasha said and a reflection of this angst that, yeah, you shove us out from mainstream society. Our own parents, we can't confide in. What do you expect us to do? For a long time, there was this concept that those who were radicalized or those who committed acts of terrorism were people who belonged to challenged socioeconomic backgrounds. And now there is loads of data which basically, and I mentioned this in the book as well, that which basically indicates that a majority of individuals who commit acts of terrorism in North America and those and in Western Europe and identify as Muslims basically come from upper middle class, highly educated families. Whether it be the Orlando shooter in the Florida nightclub, whether it be members of the Toronto 18 over here who tried to blow up Parliament and behead Stephen Harper. One of the members of the Toronto 18, by the way, his dad actually taught at a university, right? So it isn't poverty. Something else triggers it, and this is what Zamir, the chief of staff to a member of parliament, told me. It can't be about education. They had that. It could be that they were missing something in their lives, and that void they had was then filled with propaganda and hate, and took the interpretation of the narrative they wanted to hear and decided to act upon. They are no different than many other Canadians who have a beef with the system, yet we just label it differently. And when it came to labeling, of course, the media and the news. Zamir said, that's the only issue I have, that you change the language for a different demographic that has a beef with the system, is aggressive to the system, and they commit crimes, yet they are labeled differently from someone with a different background. That aspect, the aspect which I dislike, is what I call identity politics. And that's my biggest issue here, and that plays into all factors, etc. Overall, radicalized individuals are a fringe group and they don't represent the mainstream. And I'll come back to this by the end of it, that this label of terrorist and terrorism, it's a huge problem, and we need to be very careful about it. Some participants also said that the Muslim community has failed us in this country. That we don't belong with them. They make us feel like outsiders. They make us feel as if we are wrong. So, in the words of Amir, I beg your pardon, in the words of Murjan, the Muslim community needs to stop denying that they are in denial about a lot of things. So there is this idea that, oh, God will take care of it. There is this kind of attitude that things will fix themselves. Okay. So the community within their sphere is in denial about the threat. They are also in denial about their own responsibility. The parents think that educating somebody with the Quran and showing them how to pray is enough to ward them off from all evil. Amir kind of went in a little bit deeper. And that's part of the anger of kids who are Muslim and stuff, because they don't have that interaction. And it's natural too. Like, it's something that they shouldn't be surprised about. I mean, you don't want to go out and sleep with just whoever, but there should be something in place there to deal with that part of life, especially here in the West. Because it's like they say, you shouldn't. It almost feels like when you're growing up, just going through that, it's like you're being sinful, haram, just thinking that way. You are sinful just feeling those feelings, but they're natural feelings, like you're supposed to have those feelings. It's already hard, especially like you can't get married because you don't have a job or education, whatever. And going through that time, it's tough. It's hard to deal with this. But yeah, it's just that the Muslim community definitely needs programs and structures in place to deal with that part of life here in the West. Amir grew up here. Amir is in his late 30s now. But just imagine, as a teenager, you see that, your classmates, they've started to date. And then you have been told that you can't because it's wrong. And just try to process that as a 16, 17-year-old. And then, of course, you're going to find that release, that comfort somewhere else. And that's one part, a huge part of radicalization. And Zainab built up on that when she said one of the bigger challenges had to do with relationships. When it's time to get married, like I'm married 8 years now. But before that, it's like you're brought up with don't date and all that kind of stuff. And then you have to get married, go find yourself a husband, and then you don't know anything. You haven't really learned how to engage in a healthy relationship. I can understand where they're coming from too. It's those situations. Could it have been different? I don't know, but something had to be different. I don't exactly know what. Something could have been different, should have been, but what? So that would probably be my biggest challenge. Try and negotiate between culture and religion, and then what the mainstream culture is when it comes to relationships and all of that. And finally, for Barber, who did serve in the Canadian Armed Forces and was the oldest of all participants, the threat or the reason of radicalization was to be traced to Saudi Arabia. In his words, there was a lot of funding from the Saudi government for these sorts of things, right? Typically, neither the Pakistani community nor other Muslims, quite often, they didn't have enough money to be able to build the mosque by themselves. So at least some of the funding quite often was coming from the Saudis. And at the same time, a Saudi or another Arab government provides you the chief cleric of a mosque, then you know it makes a difference if you're bringing your kids regularly to Sunday school or to a mosque or something. Then maybe that's where also some of this comes from. To my knowledge, those people never openly encouraged violence or anything, but maybe they were laying the groundwork for the future. And this is really critical. For the past 30, 40 years, the role of Saudi Arabia in funding a particular concept, this ultra extremist concept of what Islam is quite well known and well documented now, starting with the first Afghan jihad in 1979. And Babar says that it's during that time that we see these Saudi funded clerics being imams here in Canada. So maybe that narrative of what true Islam means, that groundwork was laid down there 30 years ago. But he also did say that things are not as bad in Canada as they are in Western Europe. For example, in Belgium, according to him, they have become alarmed. Seeds of radicalization were planted there 20, 30 years ago, and now you can see the results. In Europe, with the integration thing, it didn't go so well. Because I mean, mainstream society never accepted these people, these immigrants and their children. I mean, Germany, third generation and all, and there were still guest workers. Perhaps it would have been worse had this been done in Canada. They would have never have fit in had we adopted the same policies. In Europe, they would stick to themselves and not even bothered interacting with the dominant society. Right? So it's better in Canada, according to him, even though it's not perfect. And finally, the hopes were pretty much the same. Amr encapsulated that. His hope was that just being able to be accepted for who you really are, just not having any fears of speaking out about what you believe in, as long as you aren't causing problems. If everyone could just open their minds and accept people for who they are and look past what your religion is and what the color of your skin is. For Maria, who's a therapist, my kids, they only have a really Canadian identity. They don't have a Pakistani identity. For them, I fear that they would feel that to be Canadian, you have to look a certain way, you have to act a certain way. You can be both. Both of their parents, Maria and her husband, are that. Right? Again, this mixture of hope and fear. So, where do we go from here? Well, I came up with a theory and I label it the compulsive choice. And this is how it looks, very gorgeous, I know. It starts with psychological dynamics right at the top, right? If your childhood experiences have scarred you, then whether you are radicalized or not radicalized will depend on how strong your family support is or not. If you have a weak family support, if you can't find or confide in your parents and your home, then the role of the Muslim community comes in. If they're supportive and understanding, maybe radicalization or the process stops there. If the role of the Muslim community is weak, as was alluded to by almost every participant, then what's your access to radicalized ideologies and outfits? How many mosques are there where there is a sneaky imam? If there aren't many, things can stop. If not, radicalization proceeds to two sets of variables. What's the foreign support that you're getting? One of the reasons why the whole narrative of jihad became huge was, as I mentioned, funding by Saudi Arabia and Gulf states. And the second part is, what's the level of discrimination that individuals face in this society? Again, if both are strong, right? If there is discrimination in society, perceived or otherwise, and if you have outfits which are being supported by a lot of money, then we come to counter radicalization, because that's where the government ultimately, as a final step, needs to step in. It can do this through diplomacy and sanctions on those countries which are feeding this narrative of jihad and radicalization. And more importantly to me, you don't demonize a group of people. You go to the grassroots, talk to the community itself, talk to the people themselves. I believe a decade ago or so, the former director of CSIS once said, and this is rare coming from the head of Canadian intelligence as a public statement, that one reason why Canada has by and large been immune from terrorist attacks is because the Muslim community itself, it comes forward, right? So you need this collaborative approach. Or to break it down simply, we need more de-radicalization centers. The funding that Canada has right now is 35 mil for 5 years, which is a pittance. We need more. We need to redefine relationships within our own families as Muslims, within the Muslim community, and within society at large, between the dominant majority and these second generation Pakistanis. We need to stop using the label terrorist. Terrorism is a specific crime with specific parameters. Not everyone is a terrorist. Not every act is an act of terrorism. The media really needs to stop doing this. And finally, of course, we need more qualitative research, right? We need rich data to determine what can be done to preempt radicalization and radicalization to violence. And on that note, thank you very much for being here, and I'll open it up for questions now.
Thank you, Saad. Just so people don't know, I'm Jason Brennan, the Morrow Center, Morrow Institute business manager, and I've happily been here since 2014 and known Saad all of these years and watched him complete his master's and go on to do his PhD research. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to do that, Saad, and thank you for joining us today. I just want to add that you rightfully, of course, acknowledge your mentor and thesis advisor, Sean, but I think running throughout your presentation is this idea of a narrative approach to peace building and peacemaking, which is an echo, of course, of Dr. Senehi, another colleague of ours in Peace and Conflict Studies, and so we thank you for that approach. I would also, before I open the floor to questions, my reaction, of course, is that we're all immigrants to this country, but our experiences are different. There are many similarities, but there's a lot of differences too in those experiences. And the one thing that echoed for me was the idea that the second generation has a hard time speaking to the first generation or listening. Perhaps it's a two-way street. But what I find is in the third generation, and maybe other people experience this too, the third generation is able to, or maybe more curious, or maybe didn't grow up in the same household as the first generation person, possibly, but they're a little more open to listening and hearing the first generation story. So for some, at least the groups that I'm part of, that's been an important part of our transition in coming to Canada. So thank you, Saad. And what we'll do, folks, is we've got one question coming in on the Q&A. I'll also allow people to raise their hands and allow you to speak if you want to bring voice to your questions. And so I see that Dean Petrie, I'm very happy that you have a question there. If you'd like, would you like to ask your question in person, or I can just read your question and just give me a second. Dean, you should be able to speak now if you like.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.
Hi, Saad. One of the respondents that you quoted suggested that there might be some parallels between radicalized Muslims and people who join white supremacist organizations. And I'm wondering if that's something that you have pursued any further in your research or your thinking, or if you have any comments on that.
Hi, Dean. So good to have you here, one of my mentors. Thank you for the question. And yes, it's something that especially considering what's been happening for the past some years now, I've thought about a lot, and I do plan to conduct research. So the way I see it is that there are parallels and there are differences, right? So let's talk about the parallels or the similarities between white supremacists, white nationalists, and radicalized Muslims. The huge one is both are identity-based movements, right? One is based on skin color, the other is based on religion. The other is that they are pretty much populated by men through and through. That I find to be somewhat interesting. The third is that both have grievances and severe grievances. And some of those grievances of both groups are genuine and some are pretty much perceived. Another similarity is both groups have this apocalyptic, historicist and revisionist view of what's happened, right? With white supremacists, as well as with, if we go through the literature of the Islamic State, we find that as well. Both are based partly on conspiracy theories, Jewish space lasers, as we have heard recently. But there are major differences apart from these similarities, which I also think we need to address here. The first, to me, the biggest is global reach. For white supremacists, it's this, I won't even call it a network, it's this hodgepodge of paramilitary groups here and there. The closest link to a network that I've been able to discover is there were manifestos written by the Norwegian shooter Anders Breivik and the shooter in the United States, Dylan Roof. Again, the manifestos were rambling, but they did influence Brenton Tarrant in New Zealand, who killed 50 Muslims in Christchurch. And Brenton Tarrant influenced the El Paso shooter, right? But those are the only 4 connections that I've been able to sort of find between even an informal networks. On the other hand, Islamic radicalized outfits are truly global in reach for many reasons. One is that for a long time, these were state-sponsored. The other is the funding is pretty phenomenal, if I can call it that. White supremacist groups I find to be more inspirational than organizational, if I can use that term or that phrase. Islamic groups are pretty well, especially ISIS and Al-Qaeda, were quite neatly organized with, an unfortunate word to use for them is that they had franchises all over the world. White supremacists don't have a charismatic leader, right? Again, an unfortunate choice of words, I would suppose. Islamic groups did, in terms of bin Laden and later on Baghdadi. Up to a certain extent, it's also a difference in between ballot versus bullet. White supremacists and white nationalists, we see them being member of parliaments in France, in the European Union, and now in the United States. So there is some semblance of, doing things the sneaky democratic way. For Islamists, after a while, the ballot really was no option and the bullet became an option. And finally, I would also finds differences between the manifestos. The writings of the father of Islamic Jihad, as he's called, Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian, and Abdullah Zam, who was a Palestinian cleric, they were based and quite deeply rooted in theology. White supremacists, their manifestos are ramblings. So I find differences as well as similarities. To me, the differences are slightly more than the similarities between them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. We do have questions coming in on Facebook Live, so if it's all right, Saad, I'm going to read a question from there.
For sure.
Yeah, the question is it is somewhat of a personal question, but I don't think you need to answer it necessarily from a personal point of view. But one of the things you refer to, of course, is relationships and the importance of that. And so the question is from the point of view of someone being a parent. To what extent should a parent be concerned of the Pakistani-Canadian community, be concerned about their children, and what sort of things are in the mind of a parent that might be helpful?
I think that, thank you for the question. It's a really good one. The first red flag for me is always if your child starts to isolate themselves, right? If they're spending more time in their room, if they've stopped hanging out with their friends, if you don't, the only time you see them is for meals, that's when you have to intervene as a parent and come in, right? You need to talk to your child about things. Whether that's going to work or not, I don't know, but I do know it's better than doing absolutely nothing. And the second is, and I don't know if the question was alluding exactly to this, but the second is that I'm a first generation immigrant here, right? Of course, we bring our culture and all of that stuff with us, but at the same time, we also kind of have to give our children the benefit of freely growing up in this society. One of the participants, I didn't have this on the slides, basically said to me that I had two personas, one in school where I used to hang out with friends, and then the other at home. And just imagine living with that burden. So I think parents have a huge, huge responsibility in all of this.
Excellent. Thank you, Saad. Other questions, if anybody would like to, they can type them into the Q&A or raise their hand. I'd be happy to unmute you if you have a question. It is nice to see several of our PAC students in attendance today. And I'm still only seeing you as names on the screen, but I do miss you all. We miss you all here at the Morrow Institute. Feel free to ask questions if you like. All right, we are coming up to 12:30, which is near the end of our time. And I'll just leave it for a minute here. That sounds good. Well, Saad, I think we're good then for today. And folks, if you visit our website at the Morrow Institute at the University of Manitoba, there will be a link there to Saad's book, so you can find more information about the book and where you might be able to purchase it should you be so inclined. And there's some chat messages coming in there thanking you for your presentation, as I do as well, Saad. And
thank you so much.
I do have one more question, Saad.
Sure, yeah.
Again, coming in from Facebook Live and from a fellow PAX alumnus coming from another part of the world. I'm not sure where Christian is these days, but here's the question. Do you think that a major part of the problem with extremism is an all or nothing distortion of identity and culture?
Exactly. I think Christian really framed it well, because this dichotomy of either Pascal Bruckner, the French philosopher, calls it rats and saints, angels and demons, good and bad, right? When we neatly categorize in human beings who are very complex, and in the words of Albert Camus, we live in contradiction, right? So we have multiple facets, but the day we start basically saying that this group of people is good and this is bad, period, based on whatever identity box, is the day that we destroy society, and is the day that we radicalize people. And yeah, it's a distortion of which has horrible, horrible results.
All right, so that does bring us to the end of our time for today's Brown Bag lecture. But I thank you sincerely. I wish I could do it in person. We usually have a small little gift for our lecturers. But thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you everybody for joining us in the webinar and Facebook Live.
Thank you, everyone, and it was an honor and a privilege to have done this. Thank you so much, Jason, and I hope we can meet in person.
Terrific. Look forward to that day. Thank you,
All right.
everybody. Take care.